going to give you your feedback on the source discussion questions for week 10, based on the two sources about the siege of Jerusalem. Fulcher of Chartres, who was a Frankish, that is a Western Catholic Christian priest on the First Crusade. He was not an eyewitness, but he was on the crusade and would have been able to speak to people who took part in the attack on Jerusalem. And the second one by Ibn al-Athir, a Syrian Muslim chronicler, writing some decades after, as much as perhaps 100 years after the fact, but based perhaps on Muslim sources that Fulcher would not have had access to. The first question was, how do the extracts resemble or contrast with one another? I'm not going to give you a full rundown of all the details of how they're similar or different, but you will have noticed how the one by Fulcher says that there was no escape whatsoever from the violence. He says that nobody was allowed to live, not even the women and the children, whereas Ibn al-Athir says that the Franks at one point negotiated with a group of Muslim captives and allowed them to escape. This may seem surprising, which we'll come to in the other questions, why the Christian writer is making the Crusaders seem even more violent. You might expect it to be the other way around, for the Muslim to exaggerate their violence and the Christian to tone it down. You'll also notice that Ibn al-Athir talks about the Crusaders stripping valuables from the mosque of the Dome of the Rock, which Fulcher, in his desire to make the Christians a good army of God, doesn't talk about them pillaging, he just talks about them killing. So the second question then was, how might we explain the violence of the Crusaders in this source? Well, the Crusaders saw themselves as fighting a holy war, a war on behalf of God. You'll notice, for example, they cry "Help God" as their battle cry. And so, on top of the usual psychology of violence in war, where often there's a release of violence after a long or difficult siege or campaign, on top of that, there's also the sense that your violence is okay because you're doing it in the name of God. You're going to be forgiven your sins regardless. And also the enemy are the enemies of God, and therefore they are fair game in a way that fellow Christians would not have been. Related to this question is, why would Fulcher emphasize the violence? As I remarked before, you might expect the Christian writer to tone down Christian violence. Instead, he seems to celebrate it. He uses words such as magnificently and joyously to describe the battle and the behavior of the Crusaders. We could interpret this as Fulcher emphasizing the righteousness of their cause. Again, we notice he doesn't talk about them stealing, just talks about them pillaging. He wants to present them as God's army. If they're fighting in a just cause, then he's going to want to celebrate their success, the way that God gave over all the enemies to them. And also they're kind of an avenging army. If you believe that the non-Christian enemy is the enemy of God, then there's no virtue in sparing them. Then Fulcher would be happy to describe how the Muslims are slaughtered by the Crusaders. Some historians have pointed out that the language in Fulcher's account echoes that in the book of Revelation in the Bible, the book that describes the Last Judgment. And so the Crusader army are like the judges of the Muslims. They're the army of Christ. It is literally apocalyptic violence. Apocalyptic literally means based on the apocalypse, based on the revelation in the Bible. And Fulcher deliberately uses language to evoke that kind of idea of the Last Judgment and the wicked being judged and condemned by God.